Initially, I had the idea, for some crazy reason, that I should try to be a writer myself. I don't know why, and it took me a few years to discover that I didn't have the kind of chops that would be, really required to stand up to the scrutiny that comes from being the offspring of a famous writer. I spent some years in and out of various graduate programs, working in newspapers and magazines, trying to find my way into a career that had something to do with words, with ideas, and I had the good fortune, after getting married and having a baby right away in the Pearl Harbor method, I decided I was 30 years old and I needed a regular job, and so I went to see Irving Kristol, who was a family friend, someone who we had known for a long time. And Irving and I had a kind of frank, Jewish conversation. What do you want to do when a lot of Yiddish involved. What do you want to do when you grow up? Who do you want to be? And I said that I had, I thought that I might be suited to work in publishing. I had spent a lot of years in bookstores. One of my father's favorite occupations and pastimes was to browse in secondhand bookstores, and we used to spend many happy hours together at Powell's bookstore in Hyde Park and at the Strand bookstore here in New York. I worked at the Strand for the better part of a year after college, and Irving had been, I knew that Irving had been, in addition to being a magazine editor and a journalist and a book author, had also been a book editor. So I went to get his advice. He sent me to see his friend, Erwin Glickus, who was then the publisher of the Free Press. I didn't really know very much of anything really about publishing, and I didn't know very much about Erwin because book publishers tend to be background figures, so you don't really know when you buy a book off the shelf who the editor and publisher is. It's not what motivates people to buy a book. But it turned out that Irwin had been a very significant force in American intellectual publishing. It was Irwin who signed up, among other things, The Closing of the American Mind by Allan Bloom. And Allan had been also a family friend and a teacher of mine. I spent a year at the University of Chicago in the Committee on Social Thought. And so when you asked me, who are my influences, all of these men were influential to me. My father, primarily, in so many ways it's hard to quantify. But more importantly, my father was a member of a generation of writers and intellectuals who were conducting a high-level conversation about the fate of Western culture and its values. And other writers of his caliber were involved in it. Günter Grass, Václav Havel. People of that level who felt it was part of their role as serious writers to uphold the values that preserve the conditions of freedom. And of course, it was the Cold War, and that's what the kind of level of discourse was. I would say the same about Allan Bloom, my teacher, who was, as I would describe him, a kind of Jewish Socratic, somebody who taught me to look at, to kind of be a disrespecter of pieties, and to look at all questions from more than one side. That served me well as a book editor. Irving, of course, was called the godfather of the neoconservative movement. I didn't realize it at the time, but when he sent me to see Irwin, he was sort of indirectly recruiting me into the vast right-wing conspiracy. I didn't know that such a thing existed, but it turned out as I made the rounds as an editor in my early years, and this is the late 80s, visiting think tanks and magazines and newspaper journalists and newspaper editors and so forth, I realized slowly that someone had to create all of these this institutional support structure for conservative intellectuals. There really wasn't anything like that. Most of these people, and the people that we published at the Free Press, were people with PhDs, serious scholars, Charles Murray types, Francis Fukuyama, that sort of person, James Q. Wilson, one of whose books I published in those days. These were, serious, intellectuals who, many of whom did not have tenured positions in university departments, and so something had to be done to support them and sustain their work. And so there grew up this group of institutions and publications, and this is where I found authors. This is the place where I went to find the people to write books. A little later on, a network of campus newspapers was created. Irving had something to do with that. Bill Buckley also had something to do with it. Again, it had to be created. Somebody had to raise the money and create these institutional feeder system, and a number of the younger people whom I published over the years were products of that network. And Irwin, who died in 1995, I believe, really deserves to be remembered more than he is. He was a very significant figure in New York publishing in that time, really the only person who would publish conservative voices. And at that time, you have to recall, there really wasn't any room for conservative ideas and voices. The dominant intellectual and journalistic paradigm was liberal, and it had been dominant for a long time, long enough that there was no feeling that anyone from the other side had to be entertained. And so we were a kind of, band of brothers, in a way. There was a lot of esprit de corps in the conservative intellectual movement at that time. There was a feeling that what we were doing was important. I felt, as somebody who grew up in New York and lived in a liberal environment and worked in a liberal community, that it was important for me, the part of my function really was to bring news of external reality to what even then I could identify as a bubble, a liberal ideological bubble.
Well, speaking of that bubble, did you consider yourself to be a conservative before you started this journey into conservative salons and think tanks?
Well, the answer is not really. It's a hard question to answer. Part of what happens in publishing is that when you start out, you're open to everything. And when I was a young editor at the Free Press, I was really an academic editor. The Free Press was one of a small group of serious intellectual publishing companies. We called them academic crossover houses. Free Press, Basic Books, Pantheon, Schocken Books, Norton to some extent, hybrid academic and trade publishing companies. And so in my early career, I was tasked with finding books from a wide range of academic disciplines in the humanities. And I would go to academic conferences and talk to professors, and I'd be competing with academic publishers, Harvard, Oxford, Norton. Never dealt with an agent in the first 5 or 8 years of my career, really. But what happens is that when you have a success with something, that kind of becomes what you're identified with, and then you get more of the same. People identify you with that, and they send you more, and you publish those books, and it becomes your thing. And so my own ideological predisposition is somewhat fluid. I would say, as a book editor, it's different being a magazine editor. If I were, Bill Kristol or John Podhoretz and I was editing a conservative magazine, I would have to have a really well thought out position on every public policy issue facing the country. I'm not a magazine editor. I'm a book editor, which means I'm an ecumenical person, and I have to be prepared to publish people on all sides of every question. And it's just as well for me to maintain a posture of open-mindedness, willingness to be persuaded, and really just a a commitment, if you will, to serious argument from whatever quarter it comes. However, yes, I'm a conservative in significant ways, and I accept it as a description, as a label. The thing is that what it means to be a conservative is constantly changing. One of the things that I've learned in my 30 years as a book editor, that first of all, there's a great deal of variety within the conservative world. Most people who are not in that world don't recognize that, but there are many different ways to be conservative, and in a philosophical sense, all Americans are liberal, because our country was founded as part of the liberal movement of the 18th century, the liberal revolutions of the 19th century, also were influenced by the American Revolution and the American Constitution. And since the founding of this country, the progress of liberal values, equality, justice, fairness, diversity, representation have marched forward. Conservatives aren't necessarily resisting that. Philosophically, they're more resisting the pace of change, I find, and adhering to certain principles that need to be defended. But the form of that defense changes every decade. The issues that come up could be foreign policy, could be the education, could be the humanities, could be immigration or taxation policy. The issues change. The fundamental principles do not. I'm interested in, what interested me about conservatism when I came into the movement was that at that time it was, in my view, more open, more intellectually engaged. The conservatives I knew were better educated than most of the liberals that I knew. Liberalism, I felt, although I consider myself a liberal in certain decisive respects, liberalism, I felt, had lost the capacity to defend itself and to give an account of its own founding principles. The book that really illustrated that was The Closing of the American Mind, written by my teacher, Allan Bloom, and published by my mentor, Erwin Glickus. At the time it was published, I was in graduate school at Columbia in the history department, and I was powerfully influenced by the controversy around that book, and I wanted to produce that same kind of effect, but to characterize the debate about the closing of the American mind, it was really an argument about the philosophical foundations of liberalism, and the response to it, it was a very profound challenge, published by somebody who really had thought through his own position in a very profound way. The response to it, I thought, was emotional, overheated, hysterical, and I remember having a conversation with Allan about the book before it was published. I had read it in manuscript, and I was very familiar with his arguments. I'd been in his classes for a year at Chicago, and I asked him, well, Allan, what do you think will happen when this book is published? Nobody thought anything would happen. I didn't think anything would happen. It was a minor book by a obscure Midwestern academic. He said, oh, it'll be just like the trial of Socrates. I'll be accused of disrespecting the gods and corrupting the youth. And damn if he wasn't right. That's exactly what happened. And so this drama unfolded. The entire academic, journalistic, intellectual class rose up to denounce him as a heretic and a corrupter. And I saw, he was right. And the reason for all the hysteria was that nobody was really able to make a cogent argument against him. So they just wanted to shout him down, rule him out, push him out of the boundary of polite society. And this is how the parameters of debate are policed by the dominant cultural authorities. So we're going to get into this question, I assume, of what is the culture war and how does it, what are the stakes and how does it operate? But this was my initiation in culture war publishing, and it was the thing that I wanted to do with my life.
When you talk about Allan Bloom's book, is it comparable, what happened to him, what's happening today on American campuses?
Well, it's an extension of the same phenomenon. Although I would say that the left has become more aggressive. The millennial left, the student left, but at the same time, a rift is opening up between the left and the liberals. So around the question of free speech. So let me put it this way: the culture war, as I understood it and have practiced it, is a struggle between the left and the right for the mind of the liberal center. The majority of people are not ideological. Americans are not an ideological people, but they are open to persuasion. So we're trying to influence them through the publishing of books. Now, when I published years ago in the 90s, early 90s, Dinesh D'Souza's Illiberal Education, my first bestseller, and I've since published 5 or 6 of Dinesh's books, and I have one coming out this summer. The reaction to that book was similar to the reaction to Allan Bloom, in the sense that he was attacked and denounced, and he was really reporting on the multicultural impulse in the humanities and the what was called the canon wars. The attempt to redefine the curriculum to be more inclusive, which is a good thing, but not at the expense of the touchstones of our Western cultural tradition and heritage. And this was really the issue at stake. What I thought was interesting about the reaction to the book is that it brought out of the woodwork, if you will, a certain number of traditional liberal academics who felt as he did, or who felt that he was expressing something that they felt but were unable to express, which is, wait a minute, hey, wait a minute, I agree that there should be more, I'm fine with there being a women's studies department and a black studies department and various special majors, but we still need to educate Americans in the heritage out of which our Constitution and founding documents emerged. This is important. America is a country founded on ideas, therefore ideas are important. And in every generation, they have to be defended anew. What I observed in the case of the closing of a liberal education was that it succeeded, I think, so well because a lot of liberal academics felt that had felt uncomfortable, let's say, with the radicalism of the campus left and its campaign to jettison the great works of Western history, Western culture, and its heritage. Now, you can argue that that's what they knew, and that's what they were teaching, and that's what they were familiar with, and there's validity in that argument. I'm trying to give evidence in this conversation that I'm open to the other side. I'm not rigid or ideological in that respect. I get the point, right? I take the point. What's happening today is kind of a return to those arguments from the 80s and 90s, and I see the same thing. I see the same thing happening to some extent, which is that traditional liberals are starting to realize that the left does not respect free speech as a principle. It's not their fundamental principle. Freedom of speech is a fundamental liberal principle. Without that commitment, there is no liberalism and there's no liberal society. As this rift begins to widen, there will be publishing opportunities, which I hope to exploit.